On the one hand, it feels like it's been a really long time since I was last here to worship with you. On the other hand, the whole time I was working on this reflection, I kept thinking to myself, did I say this to them last year? I'll give you an example. I went to the doctor's recently for a checkup. Both she and her assistant asked me a series of questions. Medications? I told them what I take. Do you smoke? No. Do you exercise? Probably not enough. Do you now, or have you been in the last 2 weeks experiencing feelings of depression? Are there still children in cages? To which they each quietly nodded her head and moved on to the next question. As I got ready to put this recent real-life anecdote into the sermon, I remembered that I had said something very similar in a sermon that I gave to you last year. After having seen my doctor and being asked a similar question and having given a similar answer. It's been a year, a whole year. And there are still more than 2,000 children in U.S. Border Patrol custody, over 900 of whom have been separated their families. 6 have died while in U.S. custody since last September. Here we are again. That is, of course, only one example contributing to the national depression and malaise. Do you know, just to make sure I wasn't completely redundantly repeating myself, I looked up the word malaise for a specific definition. Merriam-Webster lists one definition as a vague sense of mental and moral ill-being. Moral ill-being. Jackpot. Because that's exactly what I meant. There are a multitude of other offenses that we as a country are perpetuating against people who are strangers in our midst and have come to this country for myriad reasons. Just look at the last 24 hours. Some of the folks who are coming here are escaping systematic or domestic persecution. Others are fleeing famine or poverty. Some are looking for the opportunity to live a better life in the land of the free and the home of the brave. Others have been brought here against their will or under false pretenses, tricked into believing that they are coming here for jobs only to find themselves victims of human trafficking systems. And what kind of hospitality do these folks receive? How do we welcome the sojourners? Well, the readings this morning give us a good idea of how we are supposed to treat those folks. From the Hebrew Scriptures, Leviticus says, "When an alien resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the alien. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as a citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself." And if you forget how you're supposed to treat folks coming into the country, another Hebrew Scriptures, Numbers 15, explains it again, this time from a legal perspective. The community is to have the same laws for you and the foreigner residing among you. This is a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. You and the foreigner are the same before the Lord. From the Christian Scriptures, Hebrews 13 brings it all back to love. Let mutual love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that, some have entertained angels without knowing it. Remember those who are in prison as though you were in prison with them, those who are being tortured as though you yourselves were being tortured. That's pretty specific, and particularly germane to our present situation, albeit the words were written thousands of years ago. Evidently, here we are again. Obviously, the very fact that these teachings exist indicates that this issue of inflicting insult, incarceration, discrimination, hatred, and violence on strangers crossing borders is not new. The stories are documented in our histories, expressed in our music, exhibited in our artwork, and recorded in our literature. I recently learned about one of these pieces of literature, ironically, on July the 4th at a picnic in Central Park. Another actor told me about a speech written by William Shakespeare in the play that Shakespeare co-wrote with some other folks called The Book of Sir Thomas More. Evidently, on May the 1st, 1517, Sir Thomas More, London's deputy sheriff, addressed a mob rioting in the city, attacking immigrants with bats and bricks. The Londoners were angry that these folks from elsewhere were coming into their city and taking their jobs. The cry from the crowd is that the strangers should be removed. And More responds, "Grant them removed, and grant that this your noise hath chid down all the majesty of England. Imagine that you see the wretched strangers, their babies at their backs, and their poor luggage plodding to the ports and coast for transportation, and that you sit as kings in your desires, authority quite silent by your brawl, and you in ruff of your opinions clothed. Oh, desperate as you are, wash your foul minds with tears, and those same hands that you like rebels lift against the peace, lift up for peace. And your unreverent knees, make them your feet to kneel to be forgiven. You'll put down strangers, kill them, cut their throats, possess their houses, and lead the majesty of law in line to slip him like a hound? Say now the king should so much come too short of your great trespass as but to banish you. Whither would you go? What country, by the nature of your error, should give you harbor? Go you to France or Flanders, to any German province, to Spain or Portugal, nay, anywhere that not adheres to England, why, you must needs be strangers. Would you be pleased to find a nation of such barbarous temper that breaking out in hideous violence would not afford you an abode on earth? Whet their detested knives against your throats, spurn you like dogs, and like as if that God owed not, nor made not you, nor that the claimants were not all appropriate to your comforts, but chartered unto them, what would you think to be thus used? This is the stranger's case. More goes on to call the actions of the mob mountainish inhumanity. Shakespeare wrote these words at the turn of the 17th century, 420 years ago, about an event that happened 500 years ago. Here we go again. It goes beyond how we are treating folks from other places. It applies to anyone we see as other. Hate crimes are up since 2015, with the majority related to race, religion, or sexual orientation. Social media and websites are filled with entries of vitriolic rants. hate-fueled diatribes, and violence-filled images. In El Paso, Texas, and Dayton, Ohio, at least 29 people are dead, and at least 20 or 30 more injured. And multiply that by as many as you can think, and those are the lives that are and will be affected. Being rude, mean, or as we say down home, downright ugly has become the norm. And we're not just kidding. Folks are fighting on the sidewalks and in the subways and in the grocery store lines. Y'all have seen them. Tempers are short, passions are high. People feel entitled to vent their frustration and anger regardless of whom the target might be. After a short period of time celebrating the audacity of hope that we were actually moving forward, we cared about the world, we were becoming more inclusive, we were celebrating people's diversity, we were connecting with countries to work cooperatively and constructively to create a better planet. After that all too brief period of time, we find ourselves back in the place where discrimination and xenophobia and nationalism and violent self-interest have reared their ugly heads Hydra-like to reassert their self-proclaimed dominance over the guests we mentioned in today's opening words: faith, hope, and love. We thought we were making progress, but find ourselves having the same conversations, debates, and arguments that we were having 30 years ago, or 50 years ago, or 100, or 1,000, or 2. Here we go again. My mother and her husband David had an experience 2 weeks ago at a neighbor's house. A handful of neighbors gathered together in their little neighborhood for snacks and drinks. My mother and David didn't know the host of this gathering particularly well, but that soon changed. In a conversation about race relations in the 60s, their host related a story from his childhood in rural North Carolina when, according to him, the African Americans in his area wanted to take over his town. Only he didn't say African Americans. He said a word that started with the letter N. He then went on to relate that the Ku Klux Klan had saved his town that day from its terrible possible fate, and ended his story with the words, "Thank goodness for the Ku Klux Klan, may they rise again." This was just 2 weeks ago, 3 houses down from where my mama lives. One of the stunned house guests stood up and said, "Well, it looks like it's time for us to go." And all the others left with her. My mom's husband, David, said he wishes he had said something, but he didn't know how to respond. He and I talked about it, possible responses. I've been thinking about it for 2 weeks, expressing and experiencing feelings of disbelief and disgust, and yes, hatred and violence, especially verbal violence. The responses I ran through my head frequently were verbally violent. I had to whittle down a lot of what I was thinking to come close to something that resembled something I could say in front of my mama. This is the question. How do you respond to the people who are perpetuating hate and violence without contributing to the perpetuation of hate and violence? How do you stand in solidarity with those who are being victimized and hold people and institutions accountable for their heinous words and deeds without participating in verbal violence and the creation of negative energy? How do we work for justice and expansive understanding of community without excluding those with whom we disagree, and not just with whom we disagree, but those who are actively inflicting injury on other members of the community. Another thing I'm pretty sure that I told you last year is that my favorite Bible verse is Ephesians 4:26. Be angry, but do not sin. You may remember, and if not, I'm sure you can easily ascertain, that I have the first part of that verse well in hand. Be angry. I got it. I'm currently teaching Shakespeare's Coriolanus to my summer school students. At one point, Coriolanus' mother, Volumnia, declares, "Anger is my meat." For you vegetarians out there, pick your favorite non-meat protein alternative. I know how to be angry. These days, it frequently feels like it is my starting point. My difficulty is with the second part of that verse. Do not sin. Do no harm. Don't do violence. That's the part I struggle with. In my imagined responses to my mother's neighbor, the least invective one I came to was, "You were created with all the grace and love of the universe, and this is what you've chosen to do with it? Really?" We are called to remember the inherent divinity or humanity of all people, but how do you do that when the people in question are not acting humanely? You've heard me say this before. You are sure to hear me say it again. For me, the greatest way of dealing with these questions and confusion is in the midst of community. It is gathering together like this, lifting each other up, holding each other accountable, mourning the losses, and celebrating the joys. In community, we are reminded that we are not alone. We have people with whom we can express our despair, our anger, yes, even our violent reactions and thoughts, all in the context of grace and understanding. Sean did it again. I don't know why I'm amazed every single time that we work together that he's able to do what he does. I ought to be used to it by now. Nevertheless, this time he has outdone himself. He took the soundtrack playing in my head while I worked on this sermon and turned it into the music you are hearing today, including learning that song by Ken Medema. Without knowing it, he picked out some of my favorite hymns, and most impressively, he introduced me to the Holly Near song, "We Are a Gentle, Angry People." How much more perfect can you get? A gentle, angry people. Again, I'm much better at one of those things than I am the other. But it helps to be reminded that gentleness is not the same as complacency, nor is it capitulation. With gentleness, we are called to action to proclaim the systematic injustice that oppresses the vulnerable. With grace, we are called to advocate for those whose voices are not heard. In love, we are called to remember that we are all members of one family and that none of us are free as long as any of us are in cages. We do that in community with one another, voicing our frustrations, railing against the injustice, crying on each other's shoulders, singing and dancing our celebrations, telling our stories, or perhaps even retelling our stories. Here we are again. Whither will we go?